Would you like a solid defense to 1 e4 that is a little bit off the beaten track, yet still allows you to outplay your opponents and get some nice counterplay chances? Well, I am Grandmaster Max Illingworth, and that's exactly what we'll cover in this video, in the form of the Philidor defense. Now, when people say Philidor defense, most people think of e5, knight f3, and d6, which is the old Philidor. However, I'm actually going to recommend a tricky move order in this video that will allow you to avoid some of the problems that Black experiences when playing the d6 move order. You see, if White plays the move d4, Black's best move here is to play e takes d4, going into a line known as the Antoshan variation of the Philidor, but this is not what I'm going to be recommending in this video, because I know White gets a nice space advantage, and at a club level, I think these positions are way, way easier to play for White. The problem is, let's say you want to try to play it the more solid way, like knight d7, knight f6, bishop e7 castles that I'll be recommending in this video here. Well, if you play the move knight to d7, the problem is White is not forced to play knight c3, but he can play, for example, the move bishop to c4. Also, for those of you who don't play the Old Indian, the move c4 is also another annoying move order point, because the Old Indians consider a bit of a bad opening for Black according to modern computers. Engine gives +1 in case you're wondering. But bishop c4 is kind of a more direct problem, where none of Black's attempts to deal with the pressure on f7 really work that well. For example, the best try is probably to move c6 if you want to keep this structure. But then you run into some other problems, like, for example, castles. If you play the move bishop e7, I guess knight f6, knight g5 would be pretty embarrassing, right? But the problem is you're not really avoiding knight g5 here, and after take, you can't play knight e5, by the way, because then queen h5 is winning a pawn in so many lines, so don't do that. But here, knight g5 is a big problem. And it might at first look like, White is just blundering a piece. Like, what's the guy doing? Is he playing guess to elo? But actually, queen h5 is the point, and White is getting the piece back, partly because he's threatening May on f7. And after something like queen e7, queen g5, unfortunately, the ending is just very, very bad for Black. White's got the bishop pair. It's got a lead in development, and it's just so easy for White to improve the position. So it's just not really a very playable line, and I can't honestly recommend it. And if Black plays knight f6 instead, trying to counterattack the pawn and hoping to transpose the line that I will be recommending via a different move order with knight c3 and knight d7, which at least is somewhat respectable for Black. The problem is White has this extra and very good option of the move d takes e5. And after d5, knight e4, the specific problem is that White has this very strong move of queen to d5. And it's very hard to actually find a good way to defend the knights. In fact, the only way that probably isn't just losing here is the move knight c5. But then bishop g5, and we see that White's getting a very strong initiative. The fact that the computer is already saying the best move is queen d7 already gives you an idea of how difficult this is for Black, whereas White just develops naturally and has a big lead in development in open position, so not fun for Black to say the least. But if you go bishop e7 and try to, liquidate and equalize, the problem is White is not forced to take e7. White just goes ed6. cd6 gives you a very weak IQP, but if queen d6, knight c3, I mean, White is just well ahead in development, and your king is still not out of the center. Those of you who watch a lot of Gaff on Chess videos, you might recognize a similar structure happened in his game against Ivan Shitko. Yes, that is the player's actual name. But yeah, it sort of is kind of a bad version for Black. So in short, you're not really able to get what's known as the Harnham or Black Lion version of the Philidor in a good version from this move order. So what is the Black Lion move order, I hear you asking? It's a great question, and before I show you that, I'm going to also kindly remind you that if you are enjoying the video so far, smash that like button. It really helps me reach out to more and more chess players to help them become chess masters. That is, after all, my mission for 2022. And also remember to hit the red subscribe button. It's the easiest way to improve your chess. Okay, let me show you the Black Lion system. The way it goes is as follows. We start with the move 1d6, so a little bit of a shift in the move order, but it'll all make sense in a moment. So d4 is a normal move for White, right? Take over the center. We go knight to f6, attack the pawn, so they can't play, d takes e5, because we haven't put a pawn on e5 yet. And then after knight c3, I recommend playing the move e5, and this is sort of the point of our move order, that White is committed to the move knight c3. What does that mean? Well, it means that if they go knight to f3 now, we just play knight d7, and well, d5 is not grabbing a pawn, essentially, is the key point. We just take back here. And also, if they do play a move like bishop c4, well, now knight g5 doesn't come in time. We just castle, and, our king is safe. And we'll get into this more in the next 2 games I have to share with you. Before I do, one final move order point I do want to address is that in the game, Black decided not to play e5 here. This was a game between Zhang Zhong, the top player of Singapore, although I believe he recently moved back to China and represents China now, playing against the top Ukrainian blitz player, Alexander Bortnik. And I think Bortnik didn't play e5 because he didn't want to enter this endgame with d takes e5. Where you lose the right to castle, but other than that, you don't really have anything wrong with the position. In fact, the king is often quite happy going back to e8, or say if they don't play bishop c4 quickly enough, going to c7. Well, we'll talk about this more in the final game I have to share in this video, so do make sure to stick around to the end to see that this position does actually give black winning chances. It's not just white to play and, win or draw sort of thing, or as the, Soviet masters would say, playing for 2 results, a win or a draw. But okay, in the game, black goes knight bd7, trying to prepare e5 and, well, basically without allowing the queens to be swapped. And in the game, it's simply transposed, but I will tell you, quite frankly, that I don't think knight d7 is a good move order, objectively speaking. And there are a couple of reasons. I mean, g4 is one system that's kind of annoying as well, but the big problem to my mind is the move f4. And now black line players, some will say, well, I don't care. I go e5 and I still get my Philidor position. And, there are some fun lines you can try to play with c6 where, you sack a pawn, but you go bishop c5 and attack the king in the center. And maybe that can work in bullet, but I think that as a serious system, it just doesn't really hold up. For example, there's even moves like bishop d2 and castles, which, are less popular than bishop e3, but they just completely make d5 fall completely flat on its face. Computer confirms that white is basically much better, with black's best bet being to play queen b6 and kind of beg for, a draw in a much worse endgame, which I think you agree is not what we came here for. So that's the reason why I would recommend playing e5 and, allowing them to go into the ending, because it's actually not that bad for black. But okay, in the game, it ends up transposing anyhow to the main line. And well, let's talk a bit more about this line with bishop c4 and bishop e7, because actually, at this point, it's worth noting that the line that's called the black line, if we are getting very technical, the black line is actually not per se the system with bishop e7, castles, and c6. The reason I titled the video like this is because if I'd called it the Philidor, then none of you would have watched this, and, you would instead be watching some video where the guy recommends a line that gives plus 1.5 for white according to the engine, and that would have been kind of sad, right? To you to get beaten by basically dishonesty. So instead, I'm going to show you what the black line is and why we're not playing it. So the black line is where you go 8-6, which is already like almost a beginner's move way to stop knight g5. When you can meet knight g5 with castles, it's a lot more efficient, right? But after 8-6, the black line system goes something like castles, c6, a4, to stop b5. Let's say queen to c7, and then when I play some move, let's say h3 for argument's sake, then black says, oh, black line, g5, and throw the pawn at the king, and hack attack, and all this. And yeah, maybe, if you're playing this, let's say after you and your opponent have had 5 beers each and have no idea what game you're even playing anymore, then maybe this is going to work, but otherwise, it's not going to work on a realistic level. For example, just if you want to know what the computer says a5, just, stopping black pushing on this side. If you go rook to g8, saying I'm going to hack you anyway. The thing is, in order to have successful attack, you need to have some other advantages, right? Like a space advantage, for example. Black doesn't have that. You need to have more attackers and defenders. That's not applying here. Or you need something like, let's say, your opponent has weaknesses around the king's side. Yeah, maybe a3 is a slight weakness, but at best you're going to just open the g file, but it's not really enough. And I mean, even a move like d5 is just super strong, for example. And if takes, and white will just take and have a complete grip over the center. But if you don't take, say you go, I don't know, g4, and you are continuing to attack like a madman because you don't know anything else about chess, then unfortunately your attack kind of comes to a dead end. If you play rook g4, rook e1, I mean, what are you doing here? Black is just strategically lost with the king in the center. If you go knight to g4, then moves like knight h4 and putting knight outpost very quickly make white regret playing moves like g5. So, At the end of the day, this black line system is just complete rubbish, and if you play it, you probably deserve to lose, quite frankly, if your opponent is remotely competent. Because there are 50 other lines that also give +1 or more for white. This is just the most convincing one from a human's perspective. I mean, frankly, if you know your opponent is going to play g5, like, even moves like knight h4 and just, putting a knight here are just much better for white. I mean, how are you getting in g5 after that? And if bishop e7, you run in knight f5, so, this is why, if I was recommending this like c6 h6 seriously, like, I would deserve to have all of my titles stripped as a result. But as you know, I'm not doing that, and instead I'm recommending like it is the best way to play the Philidor as such. If you're wondering about the disappearing act, I was so disgusted to see the black line on the board that I closed the window without clicking pause first. But we are back on track, and now let's see the right way to play the Philidor. So bishop to e7. This is what happened in the Zhang Zhong Bortnik game. It's a castle. White played a move rook to e1. And then there's a very interesting approach I remember I first learned about, I think in it was in 2009 I first learned this from a yearbook survey. Maybe it was a 2008 survey, but 2009 was when I first played it. It's where instead of playing the usual c6, a4, and, playing some a5 or b6 or some other slow development, which of course is quite solid for black, but you're inevitably going to be worse in such a position because white has more space. I saw in this yearbook survey, this is new in chess yearbook in case you're wondering, with some different opening analysis. Well, I recommend this very interesting move order of playing a6, with the idea that if white plays a4 to stop the plans like b5 and playing in the Moran style, then you just go b6 and kind of go for this fianchetto where you pressure the pawn. And you sort of make the argument that you don't really need to play the move c6 so quickly because you're just having the pressure from the flanks. I mean, it's merely an approach like if you turn a computer, Engine will say white is better, but this is true of every line in the Philidor, so it's not really an argument against our move order per se. I will point out, though, just to the sake of intellectual integrity, that this is not something that necessarily, like, you can do in every single line. For example, let's say if you play a4 first as white, I have to admit that the a6 move order is a little bit less effective. I have still played it and still had good results against good players with it, but more as a surprise weapon, because the fact that white hasn't played rook e1 yet gives white some extra options. For example, the move a5 is actually quite annoying, just fixing the structure so that if b6 en passant and your pawn is weak, so it kind of forces you to come up with another plan like ed4 and rook e8, and, sort of switching to playing like an Antoshin variation with the bishop on c4, which maybe is not the absolute best version for white, but it is still quite pleasant. Like, you play bishop f8, c6, knight e5, but you're still worse, admittedly. And another slight problem as well is that white can also play a move like h3, and, admittedly the b6 approach is not quite as effective against queen e2 and rook d1. There was some nice analysis by Negi in the position with the pawn on c6. It kind of shows that in a position like this, like, white is just better. There's not a lot you can really do about it. I mean, I guess, again, after rook d1, maybe the best bet is to play ed4 and, try to play it sort of in a more, hyper-modern style, pressuring the e-pawn. It's probably good enough for blitz, but I have to admit that white is, is quite significantly better here as well. But the reality is you have these problems whichever way you play the Philidor, because the Philidor is not an opening that gives you equality out of the opening, quite frankly. This is why it's a sideline, not a mainline. The good news, though, is that I think it's very unlikely that your opponents are going to be aware of a6, because this is sort of a line that was a little bit trendy about, let's say, 10 to 15 years ago, but hasn't really been seen much since. So I think it's something where your opponents may not be familiar with it, and that may partly compensate for the fact that white is quite significantly better if he finds all the right moves. But like I said, I think that's also true for the move c6. The white is also significantly better here, like plus 0.6 advantage for white if he knows what he's doing. Like h3, rook e1, like these plans are pretty, if you like, straightforward for white to implement. Yeah, like say h6, rook e1. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to come up with moves like bishop e3, a5, and this sort of thing, right? And a5 actually is kind of an annoying move, which is one reason why you often see black stop it with moves like a5 and, try to get c5 for the knight and this kind of thing. But it still feels like a bit of a poor man's King's Indian where you sort of wish your bishop was on g7 rather than e7, and somehow you just don't get time to make it happen because, like, rook e8, d5, and, you've got some other problems. But okay, these are details, and admittedly, most of your opponents are probably not going to know them unless they're, like, grandmasters already. Then maybe they will know them, but otherwise it's unlikely. But okay, the game saw rook e1, and I do kind of like this this move order. Rook e1 is a lot more common than a4 in terms of move orders. So we go a6, a4, b6, and, white has different moves they can play here. I mean, if they play a move such as bishop to e3, for example. Keep in mind that there's also a little bit of a move order trick, that you do have the option in some cases to play moves like c6 and say, okay, I transpose into the c6, b6 line, but where I avoided certain options by white along the way. So to give you some context, if black does play the move b6 here, this used to be the main line about, let's say, 15 years ago, but then there were some problem lines that came up. For example, d5 was a line that used to be quite popular, just trying to, exchange these pawns to get the outpost. Nowadays, our computers think that better approach is to play moves like bishop e3 and bishop a2, and, just kind of build up more normally, as it were. Black can try to push, but it's, a little bit slow, admittedly. But it's one thing to keep in mind that you always have the option of playing c6 later. So that, for example, if you want to avoid some structure like, let's say, d5, which maybe is not actually as bad as the computer claims, but let's say if you sort of don't want to have your bishop stuck here looking a little bit silly, then, you can always play c6 before d5 to avoid that problem if you want to. Here, to be fair, you could probably still play like a5, maybe immediately or after first the move knight to g4. And you definitely have ideas like where you can go king h8, knight g4, prepare the f5 break. It's maybe a slightly worse version of normal King's Indian, but it's not, like, unplayable by any means either for black. Indian has a tendency to slightly overestimate white's advantage in these positions, so, I wouldn't sort of take the plus 0.8 by white at too much at face value. Or plus 0.68, I should say. Probably, like, plus 0.5 is probably a fairer assessment, objectively. So still better for white, but playable for black. There are also other moves. Of course, moves like h3 are possible, but maybe a little superfluous, if you're coming to the b6 setup. Because if they do play d5, you just take, and I don't really see any reason for white to have any special advantage in this sort of position once they give up their space here. And actually, it's also a very common challenge that you see white have in these lines that, the knight might have more space, but your structure as black is a little more flexible, and this knight somehow struggles to find a good square to move to, especially if you've played c6 already. Well, in the game, white played b3, which is the main line, and is going to be a subject of this game, and also the next game, by the way, where after bishop b7, bishop b2. So here, black decides just to play c6, transposing back to the, let's say, 7c6 Philidor, but where white commits is b3, bishop b2, it is maybe not the most harmonious placement for the bishop versus, say, the bishop being on e3 instead. Now, later on, we're going to see the move bishop d3 in the next game, which I consider to be the best move for white to try to keep any sort of chance of an advantage. But instead, in this game, we're going to see white play d5 and try to, well, secure this square for this knight. In general, you don't want to play a move like c5, because then, your pieces just look stupid. And, if white just plays like knight to c4 and prepares the b4 break, you're kind of just much worse at the end of the day. This could be the general sort of plan. And, f5 is a little bit too slow for black somehow. But in any case, the better approach is the one that Bortnik did in the game, where he decided to play the move knight to c5. To be fair, there's nothing terribly wrong with playing cd5 and just trading off all the pieces in the center. White is a tiny bit better, but the bishop is a little bit stupid on b2, and that factor kind of allows you to be okay. Like, you go rook fd8, knight f6, push for d5. Or if they play c4, you go knight c5, and then this pawn is a bit weak. And basically you're okay here as black. But instead, knight c5 is more giving a bit more piece tension, which in a blitz game is generally a good strategy. And admittedly, white didn't handle it in the right way. And granted, the computer's suggestion of bishop a3 to try and trade off this knight is, of course, not the easiest thing to realize with not much time on the clock. Like, it sort of looks a bit anti-positional at first, but I guess it has a logic to it. But instead we have c6, maybe a more natural looking move, but it kind of gives black what he wants, because now he's got a lot of pressure on the e-pawn. And you might recognize this is actually more of a Sicilian type of structure. Which variation specifically? Well, it kind of reminds of a knight off Sicilian, right? Where, white's piece are on slightly funny squares, and maybe, black's knight would only be on d7, and the bishop on e6 would be a more normal knight off setup. But still, you've got pressure on e4 to work with, and if you are able to get in d5 in a good version, then you will at least equalize, yes or yes. Now, you can't play d5 just yet, because the e5 pawn is hanging. This is quite an important point. So black just plays to build up the position. Queen d7 is a very healthy move, preparing b5 to kick away the prelate, and then potentially prepare the move d5. By the way, if white does play a move like bishop d5 here, it sort of is an interesting kind of question, or more precisely, interesting transformation of the structure that could arise after bishop d5 and ed5, and this is also a structure, by the way, it can often arise from the knight off, but it's kind of a better version for black here. So I play queen c7 just to clear the way for knight d7, f5. Well, normally white would have the pawn on c4 and they go like b4 and try to prepare the c5 break would be white's plan. But look at this c3 knight blocking the c-pawn. White is in absolutely no position to make inroads on the queen side. A move like b4 just weakens the c-file if the knight retreats to d7, for example, here. And so already a position is perhaps more pleasant for black on a practical level, even though the computer will scream equality here. So Zhang Zhong plays the move queen e2, trying to hold back b5. Bortnik plays rook fc8, which I actually don't think is the most precise move. I think that it would probably have been better to go queen b7 and keep that pressure on the pawn and also defend this guy as well. If bishop a3, just knight e6, and you're able to kind of bring your knight in this way, for instance. You're not really worried if they double the pawns, because then you kind of don't have to worry about d5 anymore, and you got the bishop pair, which more than makes up the fact you have double pawns that, frankly, not even that easy for white to attack anyway. But okay, rook fc8 was played, and Zhang Zhong did play to move bishop a3. And so you might wonder, well, what is the difference after knight e6? And actually, it's a great question, because I think neither player really knows the difference between this position versus with queen b7 instead of rook fc8. Because actually, if white doesn't find exactly the right move, black just goes knight d4 and is just better, as we'll see in the game. So that in itself might give you the hint that you kind of need to play bishop e6 and eliminate the knight. But the point is that now fe6 doesn't work as well, because knight c4 and, you're hitting this. And then after queen 7, rook d1, we see black kind of has to play rook d8 then to defend this pawn. And, well, somehow black's piece is just a lot more passive in comparison. White can go bishop b4 as well now and meet b5 with bishop a5 to be very, very tricky and win the exchange. And so since black is not really able to kind of move his center pawns forward due to some weaknesses in his structure and some very specific tactical reasons, it means that white is just a little bit better in this position. It's nothing fatal. I mean, bishop e8 and, you still have a game, but white has a small edge here. But instead, white plays g3 and, this one little mistake is all it takes for black to take complete control. I mean, probably white was panicking about knight f4 for no real reason. Like, you could always retreat the queen if needed. But knight d4 is very strong, and after queen d1, the whole position just kind of falls apart for white, yeah? So b5 is played. And white would like to play a takes b5, but unfortunately he just can't. For tactical reasons, after bishop d3, black has a very nice little shot, which I invite you to try to find as well. Well, okay, it's not the only winning move per se, but it's by far the most straightforward. To go rook takes a3, b4, and you win 2 minor pieces for a rook and are completely murdering white in this position. So since white can't really do that, he has to cut his losses and he plays the move bishop to d3. I mean, it's not like black is winning, let's say, on a tactical level. It's more of a strategic advantage that all of white's pieces are just incredibly passive, whereas black is managed to take the space. And, if black finds the very nice typical knight-off maneuver of improve the worst place piece, with bishop d8 to go for bishop b6, or even maybe bishop a5 to attack the knights here. Well, white is just very dominated and doesn't really have a great way out of it. The engine's first lines involve blundering back a pawn at some point, which is, of course, not what you really want to do, yeah? So black goes queen a3, which, yeah, is not quite as good. Yeah, it's still better, but it's not winning by any means. Probably white should just go bishop b2 and just try to hold, but the game goes bishop f1 and then realizes after queen h6, well, actually, probably black should just go queen d7 and kind of admit the mistake, but he went queen h6 trying to be tricky and do some queen takes d2, queen e2, knight f3, folk saying, oh, look at me, I'm a tactical genius. Actually, it's not that smart. If white just plays knight f3, then, it's not really obvious what your queen is doing on h6. Just kind of looks like, it's on a vacation, letting the little guys do all the hard work. But instead, white goes rook to e3, and, well, this actually allows different tactics. Well, the move bishop to d7 was played in the game, which is winning. I mean, computer points out knight c2, knight g4 is also winning, but okay, it's maybe not the most obvious thing in the world without some sort of calculation, but it is pretty strong. Well, black goes bishop d7, and, you are threatening knight g4, and you're also got ideas like bishop d8 to b6, so I mean, even if you play a move like Rook D3, I mean, you're still probably going to lose this as white because, look at all these pieces just flooding in the attack. And that's the power of the Philidor, by the way. It really creates a lot of opportunities for you to sort of bring your pieces like a coiled spring, bring them to life, and bring them into the attack if white does ever lose control of the position. Because, like, the position is solid, but it's also quite flexible, yeah? But instead, white blundered with f3, and he simply did not realize that the rook is hanging, queen takes e3, and, of course, after such a move, white just resigned. So quite a good starting point for the Philidor, and I know that we have analyzed this game quite deeply, but I wanted to make sure I explained all the move order points and the subtleties first, because that's something I notice that most resources don't really do. They don't take the effort to explain this is why you should play this move and not that move, and these are the differences. So I just wanted to share that with you up front before getting into these games, and, well, let's also see the next game with a similar type of line. Now, this game is a very long game, so I don't think I'm going to go through it in full, but just to kind of give you a taste of what happens in what is the most common variation. So here we see a game between Sebastian Maz from France playing against Alexander Moskalenko. As a knight f3, knight bd7, bishop c4, bishop e7. So yeah, here white goes for the a4 move order, and, well, this was a blitz game entitled Tuesday 2021, so again, we should cut some slack in terms of the quality of the play, but, I picked the blitz games because I think it's sort of instructive to see some of the mistakes that are made. They provide a good teaching opportunity for you as well. And now black actually played the move a6 anyway, sort of gambling that white doesn't play the move a5 in this position, for example, or something like h3. And the gamble pays off because white plays rook e1, and we get back to familiar territory with b6. Because rook e1 is the most common move by some margin here, just so you know, because most people don't get the difference. So yeah, b3, we talked about this before, but here Mazda decides to play the move bishop to d3 instead, which is the main line, and the idea of bishop d3 is to try to go knight e2, knight g3, and to try to harmonize the pawn structure, kind of like a Roy Lopez. Now, from a theoretical perspective, I think the way to go is black is just to play knight ed4. I mean, I guess you could play g6 first, but, stop knight f5, kind of switch back to a King's Indian setup, and then use the pieces to put pressure on the pawn. Like, that's the way that I would play it, and I think it gives you good chances to equalize. But in the game, Moskalenko decides to instead play, and just to clarify, this is Alexander Moskalenko, not the famous author Victor Moskalenko. Well, black goes queen to c7 instead at this point. And now the game continued as follows. Knight e2, so continuing the idea that started with bishop d3, and by the way, this is also why I think that it was a little bit of a mistake to play queen c7. Not a big mistake, it's not like you lose the game as a result, but, knight f5 can be potentially a bit annoying, and, white's just got a very flexible structure. Black's up with bishop f8, he played game actually reminds me a little bit of the Breyer, but I do think it's a worse version of the Breyer, like, if white plays, say, queen d2, and, I don't know, you play g6 or something. I mean, the problem is that, black is just very kind of passive here. I mean, I guess, when you play the Philidor, like, you accept you're going to be a little bit passive, but even so, I mean, like, this sort of position after a5, c4, like, white just got so much space, and, if white gets in d5, the bishop looks kind of silly, so, yeah, it's not really what you play this opening for in general, and that's why I would recommend going ed4 when white is, thinking about grabbing a lot of space. Well, in the game, white goes c4 instead, which maybe is not the most precise move order, because you give black a chance to go ed4 in some lines. Because if you wait too long to go ed4, yeah, like d5 is just going to be bad for your bishop at some point. So queen e2, a5, Moskalenko decides to go for this plan of ed4 and try to get c5 for the knight. White goes bishop c2, we have rook ad8, and I mean, one good thing about these positions, you can sort of just kind of sit on them, and even though objectively white is much better queen e-engine, I know that a lot of players, myself included in the past, would get quite frustrated playing white and might sort of make some lashing out move like d5 or d5 that would kind of play into black's hands. In general, white wants to sort of keep the structure, and, well, he plays the move h4, which is already, a form of lashing out a little bit. And actually, it's a mistake because you are weakening a lot of squares here. For example, knight g4 and bishop h6 would show, it's a semi-outpost. It's a bit annoying for white, yeah. In fact, sometimes you can even go d5 and just blow open the center, apparently, according to the computer. Which obviously, yeah, would be nice to, bring these fianchetto bishops to life in the Breyer style. But yeah, instead of h4, white should just go h3 and just, nurse the advantage a little more patiently. Perhaps play moves like queen c1, prepare d5 at the right time would be, I think, the way to go. But yeah, white goes h4, we have h5, and Yeah, then the game goes queen c1. White decides not to play d5, but probably this was the better way to approach it. I mean, yeah, c5 is available for the knight, but white can try to play on the king side as well, But yeah, c5 is a little bit of a weird move, I have to admit. Probably white should go d5, but okay, even then, I mean, it's a question of how you're going to break through as white. Maybe there is some idea where you can try to prepare f4, but then you also give e5 for the black knight, so I can sort of see why white didn't play this, even though the computer gives it as the only way to get an advantage. Because it does seem like black has some semi-fortress here of sorts. Like bishop c8, knight 7, knight f8 sort of things. Just be very solid. So white goes d5, and then, black is kind of doing okay. Bit puzzled black didn't go d5 and, try to maneuver the knight to d4. Knight e5 is a bit of a weird move by comparison. Because it's not like white is forced to take, but you can just go knight g5 and yeah, at this point, I sort of feel like the rest of the game is not so relevant. It felt like the players were sort of going into a race of who is going to self-destruct first. Move like knight e2 or f3. I'm not really sure what black is doing in this position with all these holes in the structure. With knight e2, you can also try to bring knight to b5 or this sort of thing. But white goes rook f, knight f1, and, just sort of completely loses sense of danger. After knight e3, again, queen a1 would have been super strong going for f4, but now, like, knight f d4, and suddenly black's position comes to life after some mistakes by both sides, and yeah, white just completely self-destructs at this point. You should just play knight d5, trade off the bishop, and okay, white can still pretend with a bishop pair that he can maybe fight for an advantage, like f3, this sort of thing, but instead he goes knight g4, which is just very, very baffling. Because after hg4, I mean, now you're just threatening to win the knight with f6, so that's why I don't really get why white played like this. And then after f4, I mean, yeah, you're freeing the knight, but you're also greatly exposing your own king. I mean, just look at how horrible it is when you have this pawn on h4, when you have this pawn on f3. And actually in the game, black just found a completely winning move. Well done, by the way, if you spotted as well. Because if you give white time to, play like king g2, like they can try to mount some defense, but here d5 is just completely game over. Threatening queen g3 as well as threatening the pawn, and well, I mean, something like cd5, queen g3, I think this doesn't require an analysis, right? You're just taking all the pawns with check. Even claims it's forced mate in X moves, like king here, and, king f1, bishop a6, like white can resign at this point. So white goes king g2, but yeah, you just grab the pawn in the center, and, well, white is just completely busted. Okay, black did miss the move f5, winning the exchange, but okay, bishop e4 is still completely and utterly winning for black. Take, queen f4, and I mean, I think the rest doesn't require an analysis. Black is winning 2 pawns in the next moves. White's king is way too exposed for in the rook and queen position, and Moskalenko went on to win in a very long battle that was probably marred by lots of crazy time scramble blunders that might be funny to look at, but maybe not the most instructive. So let's move on to the final game I have to share with you in this video, and this one actually is a game played also entitled Tuesday, but much earlier in 2021, between Volodar Mersin, who, if you watch my Tata Steel recaps, you may remember he's doing well in Tata Steel challenges, playing against Eric Hansen, famous chess brass streamer. And Hansen has black played Philidor and was quite happy in the game to enter this position with take and take. Actually, before I do talk about the end game, I do want to mention a couple of more points that there are other lines white can play. For example, knight e2 is another approach where white can go, let's say, for some h3, and either like play g3, bishop g2, and play it very positionally, which I don't think is that critical, but it's a way to get a more strategic battle. Also, if you go for bishop e7, there are also these lines where they can play, let's say, f3, and kind of play it like a sort of same-ish, but with king's in with the pawn on c2. This is a little bit of an annoying system, but I think if you go c6 and kind of, either play on the queen side, push the pawns in preparation for them, or in anticipation of castling, or, if they go queen e2, you can cart take and, kind of transition to an Antishin system, but where, white does not play, like, the best move order. Bishop is not as good on e3 as on d4, and this sort of thing. No, I mean, this is one way to play to kind of neutralize these sort of ideas. The position is a little bit symmetrical, but I mean, when you play the Philidor, you're not playing it, like, to get a big attack. Like, you're happy with solid equality and outplay him later, right? The other line that is a little bit more annoying, I have to admit, is what I call the chessable variation, so named because it's been recommended in a lot of different chessable ebooks and courses, and that is the move of rook to g1, which I have to admit is an annoying line. I don't have really a miracle weapon, but the line that appears to be the best for black here is to play c6, an h6 according to the computer, where you just try to hold back g5 and, just try to play solidly, like bishop e7. They can play different moves like queen d2, but you're going b5 and you try to get some counterplay. Like, black is worse, but it's not, like, terrible. I mean, the position is probably still, like, let's say, more playable for black, or let's say similar level playable to the main lines, as it were. Though I will admit g5, they're opening the file. I can understand it's a bit annoying. So if you really want to avoid this hack attack, there is a line that has been played by some strong players recently, in the move h5, just stopping g4 completely. And granted, like, objectively, it's not going to equalize either. White can still play, according to computer, you can play h3 and try to go g4 anyway. But at least then you're able to open up the, the h file for the rook, so you do slow white up a little bit. And after move c6, you can sort of delay bishop e7, and make the point if white plays move like a4, well then you're not really going to be castling on either flank. So at least practically it makes it a little bit tricky for white to play. After bishop e7, for example, and queen a5, these are ways in which you can try to put some pressure with the pieces. So, I mean, it's playable for black. I mean, you're not equalizing, but your position has enough resources that you'll make it work against perhaps all but the very strongest chess players in the world. But instead of this, well, we have the endgame, and this is a little bit less spicy by comparison. Mersenne played a move knight f3, which is not really considered one of the more critical lines. Bishop c4 is kind of an obvious question, like, how do you defend this pawn? And there are a few different ideas you can actually try at this point. One, this is what most people do, is just king to e8 and, just play it this way, which actually will transpose into the game. If you want something a little bit more spicy, you can also play bishop b4 and kind of, trade these pawns. Where you're going to be slightly worse because you do get stuck with an isolated e-pawn. But it's only one weakness, and you can sort of say that, you have enough active piece play that, you can hold. But it's not the most fun position in the world, I have to admit. Like, you can't really take on f2 for tactical reasons, like bishop g5 sort of things. But yeah, otherwise you are just kind of slightly worse with this pawn. It's not a lot you can do about it. So that's why probably king e8 would be my recommendation. Another line that is kind of interesting is to play to move bishop to g5 here. Trying to pin the knight, and this is actually the most common line. But again, there are options that black can go for. For example, the one that is recommended, like at a very high def by computer is, well, actually it's kind of an interesting question, because bishop e6 used to be the main line, but then there were some problems that were sort of found connected with, like, playing f4, and this was sort of a little bit unpleasant for black. Like, say, knight c7, f4, and, e4, e5, and the pin ends up being a bit annoying in certain lines. Maybe not immediately, but potentially later on in the game. So that's probably the reason why, the computers recommend a slightly different approach now. For example, a move like knight bd7 is one way to play it, where you kind of just go bishop c4, king e8, and say, okay, you've got a bit of a lead in development on the one hand, but on the other hand, my position is quite solid. If they castle long, you can always play, like, for example, a move like a6 even is kind of interesting, or probably best of all, just c6, just kill their knight. I mean, if you're able to get in moves like b5 and, activate your bishop, I mean, you get very good counterplay on the queen side, and it's not like it's just a basic 0-0-0 quality, like, you can actually play for a win with this little imbalance in the structure with their knight on c3 being misplaced. That's the main thing you're playing for when you play these sort of lines as black. So I would recommend playing knight bd7, and actually we're going to see something similar in the game, because after knight f3 and bishop to d6, well, computer is saying you should go like bishop e3, h3, but it's kind of slow and you got time to kind of consolidate the position, as it were. Bishop c4 is the move that Mersenne played in the game, but, king e8 was what Hansen played. Actually, king e7 is a little bit more precise because, you're just keeping the file open for the rook. It's just a little bit more efficient. Maybe he was worried about bishop g5 and knight d5 sort of ideas, but I think that it's actually not as scary as it looks like. Yeah, they can play knight d5, but it's kind of like, so what? If they decide after king f8 to, or king e8 for that matter, to, to take, I mean, yeah, the pawns get doubled, but, you get the bishop pair in return. If you get in f5, you can undouble the pawns and even be better, which is probably why I would play a move like knight f4 to stop that. But I mean, you're solid. Bishop e6, it's not like you're in any massive danger in this kind of position in general, despite the doubled pawns looking a bit ugly. But you don't have any other weaknesses in a position like this. So this is all well and good, and, well, king e8 was what was played in the game, and given that white could have started with bishop c4 to sort of prompt king e8, it's still good to know how to play this position. After bishop to g5, Hansen decided he didn't want to allow the double pawn, so knight bd7 is a good move. Castles is played trying to hold back the move c6 by attacking the bishop. But it turns out we have other tricks up our sleeve. For example, you could go h6 and then knight b6 in order to, annoy the bishop in this way and get your own bishop out. Actually, one idea also can even be, for example, if they play bishop to b3, just, trying to keep the bishop active. I mean, there are moves like king to e7, where you go a5, a4 to harass this way. Moves like g5 and knight 5 can potentially be ideas, like, say, if the white knight moves to d2, then, it allows you to play g5, knight h5, without running into knight takes e5 problems, and, you can then unbalance the structure, with knight g3, get bishop versus knight imbalance to play for the win. Though, of course, computer says still objectively equal, but it's not like dry equality, at least. In the game, black goes a6, wanting to just stop any knight b5 business and prepare b5 to grab space on the queen side that way. It's a good plan B to keep in mind if you don't have c6, yes or yes. After rook he1, probably white should actually go a4 and just stop the move b5, but you can still, of course, play the same plan mentioned like h6, knight b6, and you still get a game, even though computer says white is a small edge, but it's definitely a position still. But the game says rook he1, or the game went rook he1, and after h6, bishop h4, Hansen took this opportunity to play the move b5, and for what it's worth, maybe this was a better square for the bishop than h4, but even so, black would still be fine. After bishop b3, bishop to b7, again, maybe you should go g5, just so white doesn't have a second chance to recycle the bad bishop. Because typically the bishop is very bad on g3 in these kind of structures, hitting this brick wall, such that you might even be able to push for the win here as black. But okay, bishop b7 was played, white goes bishop g3 anyway, for some reason. And black just goes king e7, and I mean, black has at least equalized out the opening. He's got better piece harmony, like, all of these minor pieces look kind of stupid, quite frankly, at the moment. That's not to say that black is already better, but the momentum is moving in his favor. And after knight h4, we can kind of see that white is really struggling to find a good plan, like, after g6, where is your knight going? Merson's idea was quite a creative one. He wanted to go f4 and try to, get some ef4, e5, and attack the king in the center. And then, by the way, computer says that ef4 is still totally fine, that, you can play it where, they sack the pawn, but, okay, you take, they take, you move the king out of the way, and, you sort of say that, yeah, you're up a pawn, you've got some play, but, or our material is equal, but, yeah, it looks kind of scary merely on a practical level, like, to allow rook e7, but computer just says c5, and somehow, like, white is not getting through. But, okay, in a blitz game, it's very hard to see, and I think that the move that Hansen played of rook h8 is definitely the more practical one for this time control, because if white plays fe5, I mean, you just have a very nice outpost for knight e5 after all the swaps, which is kind of what you're aiming for. Probably white should just go rook f1 and keep the tension is the better way to play it, but instead he goes f5. And after g5, we just see that, the e pawn is now a very clear weakness. And after the move king f8, black is ready to go knight c5, now the rook defends the pawn, and pile the pressure against the e pawn, which of course is not the first time that we have come across this theme in this video, right? Probably have to swallow your pride as white, probably move like bishop d5. Giving up the bishop pair, but trying to be annoying with the knight afterwards is maybe the only way to try to keep some sort of balance, but after knight d5, it's just not as effective, because, with bishop d5, at least, you're attacking the bishop and forcing black's hand. But here, white doesn't have a real threat. Just king g7, you can just keep improving the position and, in a sense, ask white what he's doing. And, just kind of forcing ideas like Luke Skywalker, use the force, knight f6. Well, all you're doing is just giving more pressure against the pawn, because the knight was at least blocking the bishop, yeah? Knight d2 was played, black played bishop to c5. I mean, there are a lot of good moves. I mean, there are other ways you can improve the pieces, of course, but this is fine. c3, rook a to d8, and I mean, if you just compare the pieces, all of the black pieces are better than their counterparts here, yes or yes. Although white could maybe go knight f3 and at least try to, create some counterplay on the pawn, but yeah, white goes bishop c2 instead. Black smells blood and goes for knight g4, trying to get some forks like this. White plays knight f1 to try to cover it, and okay, it's one thing where the field order does lead to somewhat long games, because you're just playing very solidly, but if you like playing these long games where you grind down the opponent, then definitely Philidor is the opening for you to do that, and not give white any easy way to attack you from the outset. Well, except the chessball variation, but I already told you about that one. So here, black plays h5, which, yeah, I mean, it's probably not the best move here. It's probably a mistake. I think just play rook c8, so after h3, you know, you can play knight f6 back again and just say, okay, at least I keep my my pawn well defended on e5, as it were, with the rook. Whereas the difference after h5 is that now white can play rook d8 and then h3, and now we see the difference after the exchange of rooks that this pawn is no longer defended, meaning that, you know, Hansen kind of messed up, and, you know, after h4, I mean, white should probably just take and be a pawn up here. Probably what Merson overlooked is that after bishop f2, that actually knight h5 comes with a check, which means that, you know, black is not in time to take the rook, and, you know, white is up a pawn. Probably black can still hold, but I mean, a pawn is a pawn. White can still try to press here, right? But instead we have the move bishop h2, which strikes me as being a little bit odd, quite frankly. Because now after take, I mean, it's just the same sort of position, but where black has got this extra pawn, essentially. And after bishop f2, now the bishops are just raking the board. White played the move of f6, hoping for some cheapos like this and rook f1 sort of thing, but it actually just weakens the structure even more. King g6, rook f1, bishop g3, and yeah, I mean, just look at white's position. Like, it's just absolutely too many weaknesses. The bishops are just completely dominating, even in a close structure. After knight g4, I'm a little bit surprised that Hansen didn't go bishop f4 and just rook d2, but the move he played bishop c8 is probably also winning with best play. Although it does allow rook d1, which is kind of a little bit careless to not take the opportunity to penetrate with the rook, because that is really what you're aiming to do in the endgame. Yes, so yes, to invade with the rook, you know, saying of rook on the 7 franc money in the bank, to quote my first trainer, John Paul Wallace. You know, if rook g1, just rook e2, and I mean, look at this, white's position is completely collapsing at this point. But after bishop c8, white didn't see the chance, and yeah, after bishop d1, for some reason these guys just didn't occur to him that, you know, this is a thing, bishop f4, rook d2, which would seem like the obvious move, but to be fair, bishop e6 is also winning, and after bishop f3, black just took the free pawn with bishop a2, and okay, not the first line of the engine, but you are still a pawn up, king c2, and okay, now it occurred to him this idea of playing for rook d2, which white, of course, stopped with rook d1, take, and, well, black is a pawn up. Kind of an instructive point here that you don't want to play bishop takes g4, because even though you win a second pawn, you end up with opposite-coloured bishops where, you know, white just has a fortress on the light squares because black can't create a meaningful passed pawn, yes or yes. In fact, engine is already saying 0, 0, 0 after bishop c8 and collecting over here. So don't do that. Instead, you know, move bishop c4. That Hansen played is a lot stronger, trying to get in this way, attack the weaknesses like this. Bishop f3, black goes king h7, just kind of shuffling a bit. And then after doing a little repetition of moves with king g6 to, you know, to tire white a little, we had the move bishop e6. It's an interesting question, actually, whether this position is a win or whether it's a draw at best play. Because I think that actually the plan trying to bring the king this way might have been quite smart. You know, if your king gets to d6, maybe you go c5 and try to create more weaknesses in this way, for example, and try to get a pass pawn if they take you. But it's not what happened in the game. Instead, black played the move bishop to e6, white goes king to d3, trying to activate the king, bishop to g3, trying to, you know, harass in some way. And I think if white sits on this position, like, let's say he just plays king c2 and just shuffles the king around, I honestly don't really see a way for black to break through. Maybe there's some try with this, but I think that white can hold if he plays it correctly, is my feeling, due to the opportunity missed with invading with the rook with rook d2 before. But Merzen kind of misplays it a bit. I mean, 93, well, I think black can simply take the pawn, right? Like, I don't quite get why this wasn't played. Maybe black just pre-moved a bit too quickly or something, but, you know, if he's worried about knight d5, it's really not a problem. Because the difference here is that, you know, you can even just play a move like king to f5, for instance. Put the king on f4 and just, like, f5, e4, and the pawns are just running down the board. It's just too much for white. So, I don't know why he didn't play to take the pawn. We had this and, yeah, some random maneuvers where finally black realize if he wants to make progress, he kind of has to involve the king on the queen side. And okay, white plays knight e3 and realizes, okay, now I can try to get in and white should be able to hold. But then somehow white misplayed it. Probably, you know, in fact, it was a time scramble and blitz was the reason why, because they're only playing on 1 second increment. But yeah, normally speaking, like, white should be out of the woods, but somehow, yeah, he messed it up. Okay, maybe this is the reason why, because after bishop b1, it's sort of baffling to me that white didn't just go knight c2 and just, you know, block the bishop. Maybe this retreat just didn't occur to him. But I mean, white will get the pawn back. He can try to take more of these pawns. I mean, black is not in time to trap the bishop. Like, if you go king e8 or something, you know, white just can play c4 and free the bishop this way. Even bishop c8 in this way is also perfectly fine, and it should just be a draw. You have the pin, but what are you going to do with it? Instead, though, white blunders with king e2, and yeah, now it's just a completely obvious win, where black is up, well, 1 pawn after white takes, but the bishops are truly raking the board, and yeah, after bishop f4, I mean, this is just a big problem. Knight g4, bishop b7, bishop g2, game concluded, bishop b7, bishop d5, knight h6, king h7, so now the king comes back the way it came, king to g6, king f2, e4, and yeah, we're at the point now where, you know, black is just... I mean, if bishop c8, you just go bishop e6 to block, and otherwise, I mean, bishop e5 and you just collect all the pawns. So, Mirzen resigned here. Yeah, this is quite a fun game. I mean, it is true that there were some mistakes. This we expect in Blitz, but I think we can also learn something from the mistakes that were played, and there are also a lot of good ideas as well, where we saw how Hansen was able to play this very flexible setup and kind of exploit some of the positional mistakes by white to sort of outplay his opponent. And it goes to show that just because the queens are off the board doesn't mean it's just a draw. There are still other pieces on the board, and we can outplay our opponents from here, using some fairly understandable ideas. So that pretty much concludes my coverage of the Philidor, which some of you may know of as a black line, but Philidor, like the Hanham Philidor, is the technical term for this system where you play like e5, knight 3, knight bd7. I wish you the best of luck playing this line in your own games, and if this video has kind of inspired you a lot, and I think that if you watch it to the end and are listening to this now, then definitely you are very much inspired, and, you know, really find this to be very instructive, then I would personally love to work with you. I mean, I only work with players who are sort of at that 2,000 plus level, helping them get to master. And this is basically the litmus test to determine if we're a good fit to work together. Would you, if I offered you $5,000 to never become a chess master, you know, to never improve at chess again and to give up all your dreams of becoming a chess master, would your answer be yes or no? And if your answer is yes, then probably we're not a good fit to work together. And if the answer is no, then we probably are a good fit to work together. So on that note, if your answer is, you know, that you wouldn't accept a $5,000 offer to never become a chess master, then connect with me via DM. I have it in the description and also the link in the pinned comment as well. So I look forward to chatting to you guys, and for the rest of you, I will see you in the next video. Take care.